revitalize transatlantic power. This is the fruit of a years-long cooperation between the Harvard Kennedy School, in particular the Belfer Center, and the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP. And I was extremely honored to be able to chair this group together with Ambassador Nick Burns, who is not only a professor of the practice of diplomacy and international relations at the Harvard Kennedy School, but who is also former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, former US Ambassador to NATO, and former US Ambassador to Greece. It was a great honor to work with Nick in a very special time, I must say, for transatlantic relations. We gathered a fantastic group of researchers, former policymakers, advisors from across Europe, and of course the US. And what we wanted to do is to hammer out a plan how transatlantic relations could be revitalized and could be made much stronger, obviously, than they were over the past 4 years. And much of our discussion, of course, was in anticipation of the November 3rd elections, because we started with our first meeting at the Munich Security Conference. And we continued our work despite the COVID-19 crisis. We weren't able to meet up physically after our first initial get-together. But what struck me throughout the month of work was the interest of both sides, participants on both sides, to get together extremely regularly and to really focus and dive deeply into the issues that the report raises. So there was a lot of interest because we felt this is the moment, and in particular when we knew that Joe Biden had won the elections, where a new window of opportunity opens to rebuild transatlantic relations. Of course, very realistically, looking at the constraints and the political situation, the economic situation, the health situation on both sides of the Atlantic. So we are not naive, but we do want to deliver forward-looking ideas that we believe can and should be implemented to make this alliance stronger and more powerful. With that, I would like to hand it over to Nick Burns for first welcome from his side as well. Nick, give us your views, where we did this and why we're here tonight.
Daniela, thank you so much, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for being with us at such a late hour. We appreciate it very much. It has been such a pleasure for all of us on the American side to work with Daniela and the German Council and all of her colleagues. What we wanted here was not a report where Americans lecture Europeans or Europeans lecture back at the Americans. We wanted a fusion. And so we deliberately created one group of Europeans and Americans, and we have been together for a year thinking through the transatlantic relationship. We have met in München, we have met in Berlin. We had grand plans to meet together throughout 2020, but of course, we met mostly on Zoom after March. But it's been a very productive, and I think, Daniela, very, very exciting time for us to be working across the Atlantic. Why did we do this? We are all passionate defenders of the transatlantic alliance. We all believe, Germans, French, Estonians, Brits, Americans, members of our group, that the transatlantic alliance is vital to us. And I can just say from an American perspective, of course, we're focused on China. We have to be. It's a major preoccupation for the United States. But Europe is our largest trade partner. Europe's the largest investor into the American economy. And the greatest number of American treaty allies in the world, of course, are Canada and our 28 European allies in NATO, where I had the huge honor to be ambassador, and my great friend Victoria Nuland, also ambassador to NATO. And so we believe this transatlantic alliance is vital to the democratic world at a time when we see anti-democratic populism in Germany, in the United States. We see authoritarianism, China, Russia, Viktor Orban. We want to help revive the democratic world. We want to be part of that. And so that was the basis for this, this undertaking. I must say, I think we conclude our work and present it to you this evening, and I hope all of you will have a chance to read it. We'll have a German language as well as English language copy. This is an urgent task right now. because the transatlantic relationship, I think personally, is as weak as it's ever been since the founding of NATO. There's no trust right now. We are divided. We don't have a common strategy. We have the extraordinary situation, I'll say this as an American, it's so distressing to us to see the attacks on the German chancellor by the American president. We've never had this before. It's dishonorable. We cannot have this in the future. And so we think we've got to pull the transatlantic relationship together. Final point, China is stronger since 2016. Russia is still trying to divide the West, Europe, and the United States and Canada. So we in the democratic countries need to raise up our game. We need to be integrated. And I end this year-long exercise, Daniela, much more hopeful because we have an American president, Joe Biden, president-elect, who is an Atlanticist, who is a committed believer in NATO and in the US-European Union strategic partnership. You'll see under his leadership, we'll be back at the World Health Organization on the afternoon of January 20th. We'll be back in the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and we'll be back at NATO in spirit. We need a more powerful transatlantic community, and Daniela and I and all of our colleagues, Toria Nuland, are committed to this. So thank you very much, Daniela, for being such a great colleague to us.
Thank you very much, Nick. And I have seen while you were speaking that a number of members of the group have actually joined tonight's discussion. So I welcome all of you, and I'd love you to take the floor after we've done the introductory round. Now, what we thought about doing tonight is give you an outline of the report with a particular focus on the 3 pillars, which we think should be the pillars of a stronger and more powerful transatlantic relationship. And Victoria Nuland, Nicholas Burns, and myself will run you through them rather quickly. And then I'm very, very happy to welcome 2 members of parliament just after our first introduction to the report. And then we will have a number of group members take the floor if they so wish. And then you can also participate in this discussion either by putting your questions or comments into the chat, or by just signaling in the chat that you want to speak, or by raising your hand in the participant list. Now, the first pillar of what we think could be a stronger and more powerful transatlantic relationship is really the rebuilding of trust at the heart of our alliance. Nick mentioned this. We are at an absolute low. And as Europeans, we know that this is not only a Trump phenomenon, but things happened over the years that led to a decline in trust in the transatlantic relationship and in the US. And we believe that in order to tackle the challenges that are out there, we need to invest as much as we can to rebuild trust, knowing, of course, that this is almost a generational project to achieve. It breaks overnight, but it takes a long time to rebuild. But we do think this should be the priority. And this was the guiding principle of really our reflection, that many, many steps and many, many gestures and many, many clear commitments need to be taken to make sure that we can develop this relationship on the basis of mutual trust. And the second fundamental principle of this first pillar, and Nick has mentioned this already, is to revitalize our own democracies. We think that there needs to be a very strong commitment of the transatlantic partners to Western liberal values. And this, of course, should start at home. This is why we believe we are no credible actors along those principles globally if we do not manage to look at the situation in our home countries and do what is necessary to rebuild and strengthen the resilience of liberal democracy in Europe, in all European countries, but also in the US. So practically what we recommend in this first pillar is that as a very early measure in 2021, there should be a NATO summit and a US-EU summit, where both sides take a very strong commitment to each other This would be a very strong political gesture, in particular if the US mentioned very clearly their commitment to Article 5 of the NATO treaty, and if Europe made it very clear that our discussions, which we have had over the past years, for instance, on strategic autonomy and other issues, are very clearly embedded into the transatlantic alliance, and that Europe is committed to play a stronger part. When we speak about Europe in the report, sometimes we speak about the EU, but sometimes we speak about Europe, because for many, many questions, we do think that the UK, and a strong UK, is a very, very important partner in this relationship, as is Canada on the other side of the Atlantic. So Europe, we mean in a more geographical sense, where the EU, we sometimes mention when we talk about specific policies that are actually EU policies. Now, this element of strengthening democracies, which I have mentioned, is, in our belief, an essential element to position the partnership in the systemic competition, which we see, and we believe there's clearly a tendency, a competition which is growing harder and fiercer. And so our view is that in order to play the decisive role that we believe transatlantic partners should play, there is a need that we think together about how we become more responsive to our citizens, and how we deal, in particular under the impression of the COVID-19 crisis and the economic repercussions thereof, how we deal with the issue of inequality and inclusion. Of course, you could argue, well, this is a domestic issue. What does this have to do with transatlantic relations? We do believe that the partners across the Atlantic can learn from each other and should make this an explicit topic of exchange. It not only concerns us across the Atlantic, concerns all democracies in the world, and this should be a matter of common concern. We also spoke about the question, what do we actually do against the authoritarian tendencies we see within our region, Europe, of course, but also within NATO. And what we come up with as a very practical recommendation is not only to condition EU financial support on the respect of rule of law, but also to condition NATO security investment funds on the compliance with those principles. Finally, and this shall be my last point, we do think that the transatlantic partners should be far more assertive when it comes to democracy and human rights. This is, of course, an issue for Europeans who sometimes struggle to reach a common position quickly enough. We take this to the Transatlantic Alliance and say this should be a matter of common concern to be more assertive, more outspoken, in particular in view of Russian and Chinese-style authoritarianism. With that, I would like to hand it over to Nick for the second pillar. And you need to unmute, Nick.
Voila, thank you very much. We are attracted to the idea of the German foreign minister and the French foreign minister of a new deal between Europe and the United States and Canada. We think it should be built on the relationship between a stronger and more self-reliant Europe and certainly a more globally committed America, and that we have to have joint action in 2021 and 2022. Where would that joint action be? Number one, on the pandemic. If the United States is coming back into the World Health Organization, we ought to be working together, particularly in COVAX and in the desire to help support an equitable distribution of the vaccine. We should most definitely be working to try to engineer pro-growth economic policies in Europe and North America to overcome the recession. And that would be much closer macroeconomic, monetary, fiscal policy cooperation between our governments. Of course, we have to work together actions in security and defense. We believe that NATO should be strengthened. We can do that by making permanent the troop deployments that we currently have in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, and to make permanent the troop rotational deployments in Romania and Bulgaria. We do that because we must deter, and I would even use the word contain, Russian military power in Eastern Europe. And that would mean that all the sanctions that have been agreed on Russia by the European Union and the United States and Canada, all of them should be maintained until there's a change in Russian behavior. We also very strongly believe that the United States should overturn the mistaken decision by President Trump to reduce American troops, the American troop presence in Germany, in Deutschland. It makes no sense for the United States to do so right now. Of course, we can allocate troops within Europe. That's the right of any country, but we should do so in consultation with the allies. My personal view is we should overturn the decision, nullify it, and the American troops should stay in Germany. We want all NATO members to meet their pledge of 2% of GDP on defense. That includes Germany. The goal is 2024. I'd be interested to know if any of you believe that Germany will be at 2% of GDP in defense spending by 2024, 4 years' time from now. But we have to go beyond this because we have to actually be focusing our military spending on some of the digital age technologies where China, and to a slightly lesser extent, Russia, are now investing in the militarization of AI and quantum computing and biotechnology. And on security and defense, certainly in Afghanistan, the United States needs to be with its allies in determining when we leave and how we leave, because Victoria and I remember very, very well that on September 12th of 2001, the day after 9/11, we were both at NATO working with our great friend Gebhard von Moltke, the German ambassador. You committed to us. You went into Afghanistan with us. The European allies have suffered 1,000 combat deaths, more than that, thousands wounded. And so we owe it to you to be together with you in determining the end game, if you will, on Afghanistan. And that has not been happening, and it should happen now. Certainly, when it comes to China, we have to have a common strategy, and we do not have one now between Germany and the United States, or the European Union and the United States. Our view and our team is that the European Union, the United States, and Japan, and that's more than 60% of global GDP, ought to be working together tactically to confront China at the World Trade Organization on their illegal behavior on intellectual property rights, on patent enforcement, and other matters where China has not been playing by the rules. This would be leverage by the EU, the US, and Japan, rather than a unilateral approach of the US trying to balance China. We should do that. We also believe that there is no place in Europe for Huawei's 5G technology, that this is a threat to all countries, all democratic countries, and we believe that Huawei should be barred from European networks. The Australians, the Japanese, the Indians, the British, and the Americans have all made this decision. And we would very respectfully look forward to a positive decision by the European Union to also ban Huawei. In addition to that, as you know, China is illegally encroaching upon and taking over permanently the territory of 5 countries in the Spratly and Paracel Islands of the South China Sea. We ought to have a loud voice of opposition by Europe and America to what the Chinese are doing. In addition, the massive violation of the rights of the Uyghur population of Xinjiang province and the smothering of Hong Kong's democracy just in the last 3 or 4 months. We ought to have a joint American-European response to oppose it in the United Nations, and to oppose it in the debate underway in the world about the behavior of the Chinese regime. You can see that in our side of the Atlantic, China is a major preoccupation. We would like to be in strategic coordination with Europe. Finally, 3 other issues. I assume that on Nord Stream 2, we will have a big debate this evening. Most of the members of our joint European-American group believe that the Nord Stream 2 project should be suspended. And we also believe the American sanctions should be suspended, and that the United States and the EU should try to work out our differences, and they are many and they're deep, amicably and without public threats against each other in the spirit of an alliance. On the big issues concerning digital technologies and regulation, these may become some of the prominent issues of 2021 and 22. We believe that the transatlantic community should join forces to try to enable a free and fair digital future, which protects our citizens and our government systems from malign influences, from state surveillance, and from monopolistic practices. We should try to have a common approach on tax, on regulation, on competition content, on privacy challenges. In order to do this, and frankly, to give the Biden administration a chance to come into office at a very difficult time and to have a beginnings of a relationship with Europe, we call for a 12-month truce on taxation and regulatory measures that are unilateral. And here this means that the European Union might agree to a truce for 12 months so that we might be able to work out common positions. My final issue in common action will be on Iran. I was the George W. Bush administration Iran negotiator, worked very closely with my friends in Germany, France, and Britain. We believe the United States should go back to the Iran nuclear talks. Joe Biden has pledged he will do so. And that would mean that if Iran's willing to go back and to live under the restrictions to which Iran agreed on its plutonium and uranium programs in 2015, that will be the start of a new negotiation. But obviously, in this new negotiation, the agreement must result in stronger, deeper, more verifiable observations of these restrictions by Iran and of longer duration. They've got to go well beyond 2030. Our group is not united on the next point, but some of us believe, I'm one of them, that any new agreement has to coincide, I should say, with restrictions on Iran's ballistic and cruise missile programs, which are causing major problems in the Middle East. But this is an opportunity, and President-elect Biden's been very clear. He wants to go back to the agreement with Germany, France, Britain, China, Russia, to challenge the Iranians to reverse what they've been doing, which is to build up their stockpile of low enriched uranium over the past year. So those are the examples of common actions that our group believes is important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Victoria Nuland, who was, as Nick has already said, also US Ambassador to NATO, but also former Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, and is currently a non-resident fellow at the Kennedy School.
Well, thanks, Daniela. Thanks, Nick. It's wonderful to see so many colleagues and friends that we've worked with over the years and, in fact, over the decades. As Daniela and Nick said, this was an absolute joy to try to put our heads together and think about a better time. And as we like to say on this side of the pond now, building back better this relationship. And part of that takes us to the third pillar. Nick sketched this enormously ambitious agenda that we have for the transatlantic relationship to truly be the engine for the liberal world in reshaping our future and tackling the major challenges. We also think this is going to take new investments, new tools, and a few new institutions to implement, and a real knitting together of the work that we do. So just a few of those. On the new investment side, we call for a major new initiative to increase both defense and civilian spending in NATO and in the EU, ideally coordinated with each other, because neither institution has all the tools that we need, and we want to unify the 36 nations that comprise the membership of each. First, to meet the Russia and China challenge, but also to ensure that the free world wins the leadership race in new technologies, AI, cyber defense and offense, space, quantum computing, nanotechnology, etc. The second thing we call for, and this is also increasingly popular on your side of the Atlantic, I'm glad to see, is a NATO-EU task force, which has a standing staff, because as I said, on so many of these issues, China, digital, even the climate issues, neither NATO nor the EU has all of the competencies. And so we need to ensure that somebody, some group is looking across the two great institutions, pulling them together and getting the best out of each of them, even as we deconflict. Third, on the China challenge, which is going to be a real test for us. It is, as Nick has said, a bipartisan issue now in the United States, that China is posing a significant challenge, not simply to our telecommunications networks and in the South China Sea, but that it is competing now to run the global table in terms of whether the authoritarian way of doing business or the liberal way of doing business is going to triumph. So we think we need a transatlantic dialogue on China that'll include all NATO and EU states to craft this common strategy that we've talked about, uniting on trade, uniting in the WTO, uniting on technology, uniting in setting up export controls if we need them, and tighter investment screenings, human rights agenda, et cetera. The fourth thing is a transatlantic technology forum. The EU's recent report talks about a technology and trade forum. We actually split this into two, so a technology forum and then a separate revitalization of the transatlantic trade and economic dialogue. On the tech side, we would be looking to drive unity of effort on all of the security, economic, and regulatory challenges that we set forth in the report, from privacy to competition, to tax, to setting global rules of the road. And if we can do that together, 70 million plus strong, we can also drive standards in the international community and international institutions that ensure we have a digital future that favors freedom, but is nonetheless fair and protects our privacy. So Transatlantic Technology Forum. The second, the Transatlantic Trade and Economic Dialogue. Here we would include the US, Canada, UK, the EU, and the EFTA countries. And this would be about tariff and trade barriers. It would be about setting standards in the new areas, and it would be about working together in the OECD and in the WTO. The reason we split these up is because, at least on the US side, and I believe in the Commission as well, they are really different staffs take care of this, different competencies, and it's too much work for one institution. The next would be to revitalize a structure that we founded in the Obama administration, the US-EU Energy Council, and we used very extensively then, first on reverse flow energy to Ukraine, and then on diversification schemes and LNG support when in the face of Russian energy domination of Europe, et cetera. But it's fallen into disuse, and it now needs to be not only about diversification and ending our dependence on single source energy, but it also needs to be about the transformation from hydrocarbons to cleaner fuels. The last two structures, groups that we call for go to the challenge of promoting and protecting democracy beyond our space that Daniela talked about. The first would be a transatlantic fund of sorts that would support at-risk countries beyond the transatlantic space in the democracy sphere to advance liberalism and freedom. And the second would be a joint investment fund or investment insurance, maybe we could combine them, that the transatlantic community could offer as a substitute for countries out there who are tempted by the siren song of Beijing's Belt and Road initiatives. So they want to build a railroad, they need to build buildings, they need to do major projects. We should be offering alternative investment opportunities featuring and supporting our own firms so that these countries have an opportunity other than to get further bought and sold by Beijing. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Toria. And now I would like to give the floor to Jürgen Hart, who kindly joined us tonight, known to, I guess, everyone in the German audience as the spokesperson for foreign affairs of the CDU parliamentary group. In a previous times, the transatlantic coordinator of the federal government. So Jürgen Hart, please join our conversation and let us know what you think about the recommendations that we have just shared with you.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Nick, for the very impressive paper. And I think I have not to fill something in. I think it is one of the most important contributions to the discussion we now have in Germany, Europe, and US in the next days and weeks upcoming. What should be the agenda with the new government in the United States? I totally agree with nearly all of the topics. I just want to like to mention that concerning trade, I think the program could be a little bit more ambitious than you wrote down. You concentrate very much on tariffs. I think we should restart something like ambitious trade negotiations, but maybe a starting point for that should be talking about tariffs. And I think nobody has something against do more than it's written down in the paper. I very much appreciate the new idea of having a concept of supporting democratic development in the world on a peaceful but very intellectual and powerful way. We Germans do that, for example, with our political foundations we have as parties. This is maybe part of can be part of a concept of us all together transatlantic-wise to support that. I don't want to go into point by point into the paper. I just would like to start with one comment on that, what we expect as Germans and Europeans from the 20th of January on. I think both will happen. Nothing will change and all will change, because I think most of the topics on the agenda, international agenda of the Biden administration will be the same as they were under Obama and also were under Trump. It's trade, climate, Middle East, China, Russia. And I think also US President Biden will expect more contributions of Germany and Europe to NATO facilities. He will expect a more tougher approach towards China and Russia from us. Therefore, I think concerning the topics on the agenda, not so many things will change significantly, but all will change because we now expect to have a president which has a totally different narrative to his predecessor, who always needed Europe and Germany to blame us for all the things that are going wrong in his own country. I think he was not interested to solve problems with Europe and Germany because it was against his America First agenda. I give an example. In May 2017, there was a summit, US president together with the president of the Commission and the president of the Council of the European Union. They talked a lot about the trade agenda and about TTIP at that time. The plan was, as Donald Trump agreed on, to sit together, to restart negotiations on the table, to sit together on a green table and put all the concerns on both sides on the table to find solutions for some topics. And Trump left Brussels, and some days later, the Brussels bureaucracy started and asked in Washington, how can we operate that decision of our presidents? And there was no follow-up to that. And my feeling was that President Trump was not so much interested in solving problems in trade issues, but to have them to sponsor to his narrative. And I think with Joe Biden, it will be as it always was, also in the last 4 years, with most of the members of Congress I met from both parties that were much more constructive on that field, and also suffered under the situation that normal rational debate on issues on the table was not possible between White House and Brussels, respective Berlin. And therefore, we have a new chance to restart from there we come from. And I think trade issues are very important, common agenda towards China. And I would like only to mention some short thoughts on some points of your paper. I think we have to make clear in Germany, and our defense minister already did, that a strategic autonomy of Europe in security issues makes no sense, and we don't want to have that. We rejected this argument from the French president. Maybe it was also a misunderstanding between the translation and communication between France and Germany or the English-speaking world, but we think that strategic autonomy makes us weaker, because in defense issues, 1 + 1 is more than 2. We have with NATO, we have an extraordinary level of deterrence and capabilities, and two pillars, maybe of same size and the same strengths, but operating autonomously, cannot deliver that what we are able to deliver in NATO in the common approach. The only what we see is that we should strengthen European Union in defense and security issues and foreign policy issues, and European NATO partners too, because we should be able to contribute to our common goals by, for example, driving operations in the name of NATO or United Nations without only using US infrastructure, US capabilities. I would be happy to have, for example, a German operation in Mali, which is driven, which might be driven by European resources, not necessarily using Naples or other NATO structures, just to take this burden from the shoulders of the US, so that US can concentrate on other things in NATO. Much more work share between Europe and America makes it necessary to have a stronger Europe. Concerning China, I would like to mention Germany will send a ship to the South China Sea in spring next year. I think this will be a coordinated operation in European Union and NATO. It's not easy for us to do that because we only have only 10 frigates, but we will build up to 4 to 6 new ones now to be stronger. And the German defense share on GDP is now up to close to 1.6, coming from 1.1 5 years ago, and therefore we have a chance to come close to 2% in 24, and I'm fighting for that. Nord Stream 2, just one sentence to Nord Stream 2. I think the second pipeline is an economic failure. We don't need this pipeline because in this 15 years between planning and now building up this line, we saw that we need not so many gas in Europe as maybe expected 15 years ago. And it would be a joke of history if we now ban the fulfilling of that project legally and then have to compensate all those companies that invested into this pipeline, and would be very happy if the German state might pay, or European states might pay their investment as a compensation for stopping the project by law. But I'm also very angry about the fact that we never had a chance to convince others that this pipeline project is not harming energy interests in Europe, because one of the former German chancellors has private economic interests with that, and this poisoned every debate with Poland and the Baltics and so on. Sorry for being too long. Now I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. And I will come back to a number of the issues that you raised. But first of all, before doing this and handing it to some of the members of the group who are with us tonight, I would like to invite Metin Akverdi to share his views. He is within the SPD parliamentary group, the chair of the working group on transatlantic relations. So Metin, please go ahead.
Well, thanks, Daniela. Thanks for having me. This is quite a task. So, two things. The first thing is Nicholas called us not to lecture. So, for being a German and being a social democrat, that's difficult for me by nature. So, but I give my best. The second is reading the paper. I cited with to retool us, the West, as I understood, the United States, Europe, and Canada, to retool for the decade ahead the most powerful democratic community, to be the most powerful democratic community in modern history. That's quite a benchmark here. So it's impossible to go through all those details and points that were made, and I don't want to comment on each one. And somebody told me prior to this session, I have the luxury to cherry pick the subjects I want to comment on, so I will do so and use that luxury. One is, and I think that's one of the biggest problems with dealing with this election result in the United States. I think, to me personally, but everybody I talk to, it's a mixture of being really excited of that things didn't go wrong. So we have this new we will have this new president. But on the other hand, besides this excitement, it's also having a real, as Jürgen just said, the old problems are still there. So nobody would be surprised if we get stuck into the same stuff we were talking about before. And it's somewhere in between those two extremes of being really excited that we hopefully get rid of this president and getting into new spaces of transatlantic cooperation. But on the other hand, we all know the latest with Nord Stream 2, which I will not say anything about it. I'm glad to answer all those questions, but just make it very clear, I will not in my first statement, I won't say anything about Nord Stream 2 and the 2% margin, okay? I think the key issue for me personally, and this is a serious feeling and emotion on the first part of the legitimacy of democracy. I was super scared traveling the US last year of regular folks, not only on the coast, but also in the Midwest, to see this disgust about the institutions of the United States. And and I don't want to lecture, so that reminded me of things I heard in my constituency in the south of Hamburg as well. And everybody who doesn't know the great city of Hamburg, economic-wise, last year, we did extremely well. There was no reason whatsoever to have any attitude like, I would say, the Ohio Valley and the victims of the structural changes in the energy sector, okay? So more or less, a big group of winners in the West, in the great city of Hamburg. And still, I was able to listen, to hear those voices that remind me of a Trump rally in Cincinnati, Ohio. There is something in this Western democracy going on that, and this is my true belief, has a connection to the relationship between our nations. It is not a separate issue of each society. It is something in our liberal democracy which maybe we didn't cherish enough, maybe we didn't put enough energy to it, maybe it's just the changes in the world and globalization and the rise of China. It might be all those challenges from outside, but something has changed that it's not given as an prerequisite that we are all identify ourselves with our society as it was structured in the past. And I think this problem is still there even with this election. And it's still there also in Europe. And I think if the goal is to be the engine of the West, and I mean the West not geographically, I mean it as a sense of values and also interests maybe, but mainly values. And maybe the difference doesn't really matter that much once you are really part of the West, is we have to deal with this problem. And I want to emphasize this point in this paper. I was not surprised. I expected it to be there, but I see a development in our Western conversation that the part of our citizens, you don't have to be a social democrat for this, by the way, to address the problems of income inequality, inclusion, and racism. This list could be longer. And this list identifies to me the criteria to be identified with our democracy by our citizens. And if this doesn't work out, it will be impossible for us to have a big summit on how to deal with China, because my folks back at home will tell me, so what is the difference between a Chinese company and a US company? Come on. This is just a competition issue, right? It is also a question within the European Union. Are we just partners in competition, or is there more to it? And what does each individual has to it? I think we saw with this administration the past 4 years that this can devastatingly have a super big impact on our international affairs. It is not a domestic issue, especially not in the West. And this is what I would call for, with all those forums and dialogues and groups that are aimed at to meet for the energy sector, of course for trade, of course for security reasons. We should always keep in mind that we are a liberal democracy and we are communicating constantly with our population about this. So how can we get to a point that this is not an elite project with a new government in the United States and hopefully a reasonable government in Germany, but also I hope in France after the next election in France. How can we do this? And I think we have to communicate with all those international meetings also that we are really not only suffering with a former steel worker in Pennsylvania. I think we've a little overdone it with this one person, but there are others as well, other individuals in Germany, in the United States, in the Western world. And changes are ahead. Changes are ahead. If there are a lot of people out there that are going to go to the midterm election as well, that when they hear the word climate change and Green New Deal, they are frightened. They are frightened that their lifestyle would have to change in the future, and they are not really counting on the administration that they will help them to get through this change. And this can have an impact on the international security, as we've seen with the last president, or the still sitting president in the United States at this point. This could happen to Europe as well. We are not immune to this. So strengthening the liberal democracy is my first point. The second point is, I think there is a particular challenge with China. That's my second point I want to make, because I think there's a misunderstanding between my US friends and the German debate about China. It used to be, this is my personal impression, that mainly 5 years ago, basically, the China issue was not an issue in Germany. So Europeans traveled to the United States, and we're more or less confronted with these problems that rose on the horizon and would become bigger and bigger and bigger. And now, obviously, the German debate has caught up on those last years, but we are still not up to par what that means for us. And just want to point out one particular point. This is on the 5G issue as we have it now. As we might have, I don't know about Jürgen Hartwood, your opinion on this one, but how we will end up in our laws we are changing now within the next weeks, I would assume. The big change, and I want to address this towards my American friends and partners. The big changes Germany faces for, I'm not saying the first time, but the rare occasion to face, it's a political decision and not just on economic issues, whether you allow a foreign supplier to your market or not. And it's super difficult in our system to implement a political decision on those investments. We are not really experienced with that. We had some experience in the past. Nicholas, you mentioned what you expect on investment screening. Germany had a big problem of institutionalizing those screenings, but we are just starting on this one. And I think it is fair to say that probably there will be some disappointments on the American side that Germany is just not catching up fast enough on this issue. So I just want to mention this one. I think we're on a good path, on a good way, but our speed is still not up to par. And the third one is, I'm never tired to say this in transatlantic routes, there will be no way back to the past, but just mentioning it, because this was before I was born. In the early 60s, we had 300,000 military personnel only in West Germany. With all the civilians working for them, we had, and rotating after months, we had millions and millions of American citizens in Germany. And I just want to make this point, don't underestimate how important that was for the German-American relationship. So if we end up now having 30,000 today, or even less or more, depending on what president decides on what side, it's a total different dimension as it was back then. And we are still not having an alternative for that. I think Zoom conferences will not substitute for this, okay? There has to be some sort of other master plan between companies. Just partnership programs with scholarships will not make up this super big number. And if we don't have this special relationship, we cannot expect our populations to believe it's a special relationship. So if you want to be the engine of the Western world, as I understood this paper, you have to be the engine. So where is the engine? This is what I'm asking. Those were my 3 points. Thank you. I hope I didn't take too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Metin. It was great to have your view as well. So in your contributions, the tech issue came up, and I would like to hand this to 2 members of our group. And then I would also like to pick up trade, as Jürgen Hart has asked or has told us we were not quite ambitious enough, and we'll discuss that with you as well, what our considerations were there. So Catherine Kluwer is with us. She is the Executive Director of the Future of Diplomacy project at the Harvard Kennedy School, has been very, very active on this whole project and has co-authored the tech chapter or the tech action plan with David Sanger, who is with the New York Times. Both of them are here tonight, and I wish to give the 2 of you the floor to give us a little more detail on our reflections on the tech issue.
Well, thank you, Daniela. And first of all, Metin, thank you for bringing up the role of American civilians for German-American partnership, because I would not be here this evening if it were not for that precise union between an American DoD civilian and German from Hamburg, my parents. And so this report and this work has been particularly personal to me, as Metin and others on this call know. To pick up on your point on 5G and extrapolate a little bit into David and my thinking around particularly the technology forum and the different areas that we think critical to address in the next year, but in the years to come, I think you put your finger right on it. We have a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of new technologies, quote unquote, they're already here, in our entire security architecture and fundamentally in our lives. So the way that we perceive 5G in many European countries is still through the lens of telecom, and you have alluded to the fact that thankfully many European countries and the German government increasingly is coming around to seeing the 5G issue as an integrated security issue. And if there were any questions about why we need to think this in a wider dimension, and instead of pursuing different forms of dialogue or different buckets of dialogue, and why David and I, in conversation with our strategy group, thought we needed something that was wider, we're trying to put on networked technology, which works in this sort of integrated fashion, bureaucratic structures that in fact bifurcate and separate issues from one another. But we all woke up this morning to the news of a cyber attack on the European Medical Association, on the data for the Pfizer and BioNTech vaccine. So I think that already underlines how we need inclusive security solutions that bring in the tech dimension. And of course, the news of the antitrust lawsuit brought by dozens of American states and the FTC in the United States against Facebook, I think will resonate with the Europeans who have been working in a number of ways toward an entire integrated package, effectively, of laws and regulations to push back against the monopolistic overreach of American tech companies. But it also goes to show, again, that we can't deal with these issues in isolation. And so what we are calling for in the action plan is to bring together executive function in the United States, in Europe. We're calling also for a European tech envoy, people who are a person who with staff and resources is emboldened to bring these issues together. And a similar role at NATO, because again, we cannot separate a number of these critical issues in technologies. And in the chat, it was brought up that yes, it's not only quantum computing we need to be looking at, but it's quantum technologies and the entire range of dual use technologies in NATO and the entire cyber dimension in all of its facets. So that was our point of departure. But as Nick and others have brought up, the first thing we need to do is get on the same page when it comes to our understanding of technology. And I think that is critical in the 5G issue. That's why we call with such vehemence for a truce on the digital taxation issue, because it does not help for European member states to now avenge before we have had a chance to return to the negotiation table at the OECD. Those are some of the very concrete steps that over the next 6 months can be happening while we build together executive space or an executive action on all these interlinked issues.
Well, thanks, Catherine, for that. Catherine's laid out, I think, very well what some of our recommendations were. Just wanted to say something about the integration of the technology issues with the security issues that you heard Nick and Toria talk about as well. We are at the point right now where the distinction between what many in Europe would regard as commercial technologies and what we would consider some of our biggest problems in the world of technology are really indistinguishable. We're at the spot, as Catherine pointed out, where the attack you're worrying about from Russia is not the Volga Gap, it's the European Medicines Agency, or it is attacks on election systems, or it is gray area technology work against Ukraine. So these are all territories where this is a critical arena. And one of the analogies that we were using in the course of our year-long conversation, and it was a terrific conversation, was what would happen if we asked our European and NATO allies, would you buy F-35s from the Chinese? I mean, after all, they're half the price of the F-35 that you can buy from the United States. Might make sense to double the size of your fleet and get them. And of course, we'd say that's crazy. We would never buy an F-35 from a potential adversary nation. So how is it that you would put a communication system on which the NATO alliance depends, not just your classified stuff, but just your unclassified communications, on a 5G system built by Huawei that, forget for a moment the question of whether or not Huawei might be able to listen in. The Chinese seem to be pretty good at listening into conversations in Europe and the United States in our old 3G and 4G networks, but instead could cut it off. What do you do about problems like China Telecom, where we've had evidence of rerouting of calls right through Beijing's? So what do you do about the TikTok problem, which is essentially the problem that you have people updating apps that go into your phones, but you don't know what's in the update, and therefore what the effects could be inside the phone. And part of the disconnect between Europe and the United States right now is that many of our European friends are still thinking of this in an economic zone primarily. And I think, as one of our presenters from Germany just said, it's taken a while to understand the political decision here, and I understand that, but it hasn't taken the Chinese a while. They have an integrated plan of technology independence by 2025, and of military and technological and economic superiority by 2049, which of course will be the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Revolution. And so they've been making steady progress. It's not going to be, they're not taking over the world here. They're going to run into problems themselves, because technology projects always do. but we're not even debating right now how you go counter Huawei with a joint effort between the United States and Europe while they're moving forward. And one of the lessons of the 5G experience is you can't fight something with nothing. One of the reasons the Americans blew it on all of this is that they just came out and threatened, if you buy from Huawei, we're going to cut off your intelligence. Instead of saying, here's an equally low cost joint venture operation between the United States, Ericsson, Nokia, that gives us an alternative and that would be a winner for American workers, for European workers, and would give you the independence as well. And part of the reason that we're not having that conversation is that we have wrapped ourselves up, particularly in Europe, but also in the United States, in questions of what are the privacy implications? Is Facebook too big? Is Google too big? They're all important questions which we do have to take up, but we have to take it up after we have sort of settled on a common theme for how we're going to compete jointly. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Catherine. I'd now like to bring in Anthony Gardner, who used to be the US ambassador to the EU. Tony, I'd like you to comment on two things. One is Jürgen Hart's claim that we could have been slightly more ambitious on trade. So should we? Is it realistic? And the second question comes through the chat, where there's a comment on what we say about conditioning, for instance, IMF lending. And the question here is it about changing the instruments, the Bretton Woods system, or should we rethink really the approach, the fundamental approach of, basically global economic governance? Are we in a new era now? So do we need a complete rethink? Floor is yours.
Well, it's good to see Jürgen again. And I always agree with what Jürgen says. I saw him recently in Berlin. What can I say? Look, I agree, but let me explain. First, if we actually could achieve what we set forth in this report in the next 2 to 4 years, I would be overjoyed. Some may think it's unambitious, but actually, if you consider the time horizon to be 2 to 4 years, that I think it would be tremendous if we actually got it done. I say 2 to 4 years because, I think everyone working on this report was very much influenced by the fact that we have a huge amount to do domestically in the United States and also domestically in Europe. Foreign policy will perhaps get less bandwidth. And that the prior attempts to do ambitious things in trade have failed. I mean, we were both involved in that, Jürgen, TTIP. We're not going back to those days. But just a few remarks. First, truce is a word that's been used, I think, at the beginning by Nick. And I just wanted to repeat how important this is, to give peace a chance. None of what we said in the report is going to happen if we start fighting on trade, or if we start fighting on privacy and digital issues. So we need to give peace a chance on Airbus and Boeing, on the digital sales tax, on the Digital Services Act and the Digital Services Market legislation in the EU. We need to be pragmatic. I think one of the lessons we learned in TTIP is we can't afford to fight the battles of the past. Some of those battles were really hopeless and in fact counterproductive, ISDS and GIs and hormone-treated beef and so forth. The agenda we set forth in the report actually is perhaps not ambitious, but there's a lot there. It's relatively uncontroversial and it's doable. And I think there's going to be a huge premium on doing this. We talk about getting rid of industrial tariffs, two-way tariffs on trade, which is essentially what we did in TTIP. We agreed on doing it. And that would have to be accompanied by some movement on agriculture and not on the issues that some of which I've mentioned, like hormone-treated beef and so forth, but on some of the plant and animal health issues, which are actually economically significant. I'll just give you one example. Some people may have picked up that I refer to molluscan shellfish in the report. And people say, what's going on? That sounds like an awfully technical issue, but I talk about that because it took us 10 years to agree that the way we test shellfish in the EU and the United States was functionally equivalent, basically leads to the same degree of safety. 10 years. We cannot afford to be spending 10 years on these kind of debates. There are lots of other examples, by the way. Regulatory cooperation can be done in some very specific areas. I mentioned a few in the report. WTO reform is hugely important, and China is the issue. On standards as well, deserves to be highlighted here. Werner von Siemens said something very true. He said, "He who writes the rules owns the markets." And the Chinese have understood this, and the Chinese have come up with a China Standards 2035 program, which has gotten less attention than their China Economic 2035 program. But all of these things are hugely important. Supply chain diversification, resilience, together we should be working on. And I haven't mentioned the US-UK trade agreement. Now, if we could get all these things done, I would be truly overjoyed, because we need to be focusing on the doable in the next 2 to 4 years. On the second question, I'm really not the person to answer this, Daniela. And I don't think we're going to get this done in 2 to 4 years. In terms of, if the question is one of fairness, I think that is a very deep and important question, which indeed both sides of the Atlantic have to focus on. Let me take just very quickly the question a slightly different direction. There is no chance that we can protect trade liberalization if we don't address the issue of fairness. And we have failed clearly on both sides of the Atlantic, and address the frustrations of those who feel that indeed the benefits of free trade are flowing to the few and not to the many. That is a longer term perspective here, but trade adjustment assistance in the United States and the pools of money available in Europe at a member state level and the EU clearly are both not enough and are not well targeted enough to protect what I think is one of the most important promoters of prosperity in the world, and that is trade. I know it's not a direct answer to the question, but I would like us to be working on that issue. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tony. I'd like to invite Christy Wright to comment on some of the security issues that have been raised. Christy, tell us from where you're joining us. I know you're between 2 countries most of the time, and give us your comments.
Yes, hello to everyone. And first of all, let me say it has been great to be part of the group. And although we were discussing over Zoom all these hours, it was very stimulating. And I want to share one kind of general takeaway from these discussions, which is that I found we often had more disagreements among the European participants than actually between the Europeans and Americans, which I guess is kind of a good news for the transatlantic relationship, that we couldn't see this cleavage between the US and Europe in the group. But on the security issues, well, actually, sorry to repeat things that have been said, but even when we talk about security, I would like to highlight first the importance of shared values, and that we can now get back to a situation where we have this glue of shared values that kind of holds the transatlantic allies together. And that also provides the kind of shared pillar on which we build what we do globally in the world. And we have been talking a lot about the challenges to democracy from within, and I think it has to be said from different corners of Europe. I'm right now in Helsinki, but kind of sharing my life, dividing my life between Estonia and Finland. And we see these domestic challenges to our democracies, such as rise of radical right-wing populism in different parts of Europe. It's familiar also in our countries. And we need to have now this joint commitment again coming from both sides of the Atlantic, this understanding that revitalizing our liberal democracies is important, And it's also important for our security, because it provides the basis for cooperating on security matters, and it provides the basis for our joint commitment to defense of Europe, which is, of course, for someone coming from Estonia, it's a crucial issue. And this is one point that we make in the paper, that, of course, Europeans need to do more for their own security. We all agree on that. We could not avoid in the group these frustrating conceptual discussions of whether we can talk about strategic autonomy or not, but we agree that Europe needs to do more, but at the same time, the contribution of the US to European security remains indispensable. And that's especially so when we talk about defense and deterrence vis-a-vis Russia. And this is something where the US and Europeans together need to continue to develop credible deterrence, because when we look at Russia, the challenges to our security are not changing in the foreseeable future. So we need deterrence. We also need new efforts to tackle different types of threats. It has been mentioned earlier today, the problems such as election interference, such as disinformation, such as hacking of the IT systems of parliaments in different countries that we have seen in recent years. So a joint transatlantic new effort is needed to actually tackle all of these issues. And my final point, which has not actually been mentioned, but this problem is not going anywhere. It's this issue that we have a fundamental disagreement with Russia, between Russia and the West, on the European security order. And we see Russia constantly violating some of the core principles of European security order, especially in Ukraine. And here we need to have a very consistent policy of imposing costs as a result of violations. Sanctions was mentioned before. We need to be consistent on that, and also consistently support Ukraine in its efforts to defend against the Russian aggression. So these were, yes, some of the issues I wanted to highlight. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. And as we are discussing transatlantic security, I would like to give one question from the chat to Toria. There is a question by Simona Sauer who asks for more details on the EU-NATO Standing Task Force. Toria, could you maybe elaborate a little on that idea, which is part of the action plan you co-authored?
So the idea here is that you would have designated senior representatives from each organization to the other. They would have a designated staff, and they would, in all of these lines that we've talked about, civilian and military defense capabilities initiatives, agenda on China, agenda on digital, try to pull together the work of the two organizations, ensure that there are no gaps, ensure that there is no overlap in expenditure, and get the best out of the 36 nations all together. Because, you know, on many of these things, there are hard security and defense things that can be done by NATO. There are economic and sanctions and other affirmative tools that can be in the province of the EU. But if you're going to have a comprehensive policy, you have to pull the best out of both. So, you know, obviously it would have to evolve, and you'd have to have staff members on different topics, but that's the idea there. And it also would be a way of incorporating all 36 member states of both organizations and keeping the UK also attached more tightly to the EU side of things.
Thanks very much, Toria. I'm conscious of time, as getting quite late, at least in Europe. So I would like to use this moment now to hand the floor back to Metin Hagverdi and to Jürgen Hart to reflect upon what they've heard after they spoke. So maybe you have some thoughts, and then I would like to come back to Nick and Toria, but also to us, I'd love to ask Tori, who was the research director for this project, to share her thoughts when we close off.
Metin should be the first.
Yes, why don't I take you in reverse order?
That's
Metin, please
right.
go ahead.
I think this is an important time. The question is how we institutionalize the transatlantic setup after this election, after this US election. So it will be super important to get the right players on the table. And I think, as I understood, I found this interesting that there is more miscommunication in between the European partners than between the transatlantic, between the US and Europe. Maybe we Europeans need a little support on the US side and not only a bystander perspective. So I think we should use this spirit as it is now for being for getting rid of this president, to put it right clear. But the question remains whether Donald Trump was the exception or whether Joe Biden will be the exception for the next decade. So I think there has to be some really there have to be some results that makes it worth for the audience to follow the transatlantic community and to see a benefit for our nations. And I'm not 100% convinced that this is already a debate that influences the people, the citizens of our countries, and not only a geopolitical sphere that a bunch of intellectuals and state leaders are interested in. I think we have to try to connect this transatlantic story back again to each individual, so it doesn't backfire in the future. The chances are pretty good now because we've seen where this can take us if populist leaders get their hand on the steering wheel, especially of the United States. So there's a good chance now we should use it.
Thanks, Metin. Jürgen.
I just want to share one idea with you concerning China. I think we have to fight for our liberal democracies, and the challenges from authoritarian regimes, autocratic regimes like Russia. It's from right populists and left populists that blame democracy as palaver and calling for the strong man or woman in the first row. And the third is that what we see from China. This is smart imperialism, I would like to say, and this changed in the last 5 to 10 years. China was not as aggressive as it is now in the past. I think never in its history. And therefore, we have a new challenge. I'm also a great fan of cooperation between Europe and North America concerning that. But I think we should also integrate our like-minded countries like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and others in the region. And we should not miss to also integrate India, which is not a perfect, but the by far biggest democracy in the world. And I think the challenge coming from China is also a chance to bring us closer, us North Americans and Europeans, closer to India. And we need India concerning the development in the Far East. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. I would now like to bring in Tori Tausig, who not only provided the first draft of the report and was really a key person in running this project, but also she authored the action plan on China. So Tori, would you like to react to what we've just heard on China, but also share your observations of tonight's debate on any of the points you'd like to come in on?
Yes, thank you very much, Daniela. This has been a fascinating discussion. I'm glad we have so many of our strategy group members here to talk about Russia, trade, technology. As I'm sure all of the participants can tell, this is a fantastic group, incredibly accomplished, very smart, we've had very interesting discussions over the last year. I worked on the China Action Plan, which has come up a number of times in tonight's discussion. And this is a challenging issue because unlike a number of the other critical issues we face, such as the pandemic, such as the economic recession, such as climate change, China presents a challenge to our societies that I don't think citizens can feel on the day-to-day level that we can as in dealing with the pandemic or in the economic recession. So at the moment, it is more of a foreign policy community issue, to bring up something that Metin was talking about earlier. But we are at a moment of urgency, I think, with China, where our societies, our countries now maintain a moment of leverage that we will not have in the next 5-10 years. NATO is the most powerful military alliance in the world, but as we mentioned in our report, it is falling behind technologically. Our countries are the most powerful economic forces in the world, but China will overtake us in the next decade. So if we are to make strides in reforming the rules of the road, reforming our institutions, reforming trade and what have you, the moment is now, because China is ready to rewrite these rules and will do so if we don't use our common leverage to make changes to these institutions, to these rules, and to these standards now. So that's one point I have to make on China. The final point I'll raise, and this has come up a few times, is on the importance we have to place on strengthening our own democratic societies, institutions, and norms. I think the last 4 years in particular have been a tough time for both sides of the Atlantic in looking at our own weaknesses, whether that be in systemic racism or in the rise of populism on both sides of the Atlantic. And so I think what was interesting about this group is we were really introspective in how we have to strengthen our own societies, our own governance models, so that we show we can provide a better future for our citizens than the one presented by authoritarian models, whether that be in Russia and in China. And again, I think the moment to do so is now. We have a great opportunity ahead of us in the next few years with the Biden administration and with a lot of enthusiasm to take on these challenges in Europe, in Canada, and in the US. And so I'm very glad we were able to do that as a group. And now we have an opportunity to begin implementing on these many plans we've discussed. Thanks, Daniela.
Thank you very much, Tori.
I tried to read what was on the wall behind her.
One says, etwas Realität bitte, a little less
Yeah.
reality, please.
Yeah. And on the other side. Okay, thank you.
It's what I try to live by every day.
Yeah, we did try to be really realistic. Now I'd like to come back to Toria and Nick, maybe with one question that came up in the chat, and that's what are really the priorities, because this is such a long list, and we were ambitious indeed. But Toria, maybe share any comment you wish, but also highlight what would you like to see achieved at the year 2021.
Well, thanks. It's been a fantastic discussion and a great seed bed for the work that we have to do together. I don't want to prioritize these issues. Sadly, as Tori just said, we've got to do all of them, and we've got to seize the moment now before China gets stronger than we are, before our own democracies get weaker, and before our own people give up on the transatlantic space, as Metin said. What I did want to say was that the United States has just had a powerful test of America first, America unilateral, America alone. And it didn't pay particularly well for us. Our farmers took all the heat in the sanctions that we had to put on China. We didn't share that load, and we're not any better off in those negotiations than we were 3 years ago. We haven't addressed any of the tech challenges, the climate challenges. We're not particularly more advanced in security terms than we were, except that defense budgets were strong. And so the question now becomes, can we keep our citizens engaged and supportive because they see that when you do it with allies and partners, more success is achieved, right? And I think China will be the particular test bed here. If we can unite in creating left-right limits for China and regaining the initiative in terms of setting global standards ourselves in all of these domains, and resuscitate the liberal spirit and understand that there is a serious authoritarian challenge, then our populations, I think, will rally around. And interestingly, much to the gratification of those of us who served at NATO in the United States over the last 4 years, public opinion polling support for NATO has skyrocketed, numbers Nick and I wish we had had in the aught years, and similarly around multilateralism, because Americans didn't like being alone. So let's reach this hand together. Let's make it produce some concrete results. And as Jürgen said, we must be the core of the global democratic community and then expand it with all of our Asian and other partners. And, you know, let's hope that this China challenge doesn't become so existential that it is a threat that's galvanizing. Let's have it instead be a challenge that's galvanizing. Thanks, everybody. It's been a great night.
Thank you, Toria. Nick, I would love you to comment on one question from the chat, which is on what can we do in the transatlantic relationship to strengthen human rights and work for human rights more effectively. So maybe in your conclusion, could you pick up that question as well?
I would be happy to do that. And first, I want to thank all the Germans on the call. It's late. You've stayed with us. We really appreciate it. And I'll try to be brief. Balkan Devlin asked, where is Canada? We tried to build Canada into this report because Canada is our vital ally in North America and our vital neighbor, our great neighbor, and a big part of the West. Second, Metin, I was really struck by what you said. And you're right. We need to connect our foreign policies to our home front, to what's happening to the people in Germany or the United States. I can just say here in the United States, the pandemic has exposed the gross inequality of income in the United States and of opportunity. It's exposed the very weak social safety net. You have a much stronger social safety net. Good for you. I wish we had it in Deutschland. We have a weak one. And I think you should expect that Joe Biden is going to focus intently on the United States first. He has to. We're a divided country. We have the pandemic is ravaging the country. The recession has made a big impact, a negative impact on our economy. So the problems begin at home. And I certainly hope that we'll have a stronger social safety net, a stronger consciousness that we need to support each other in America. Jake Sullivan, who's the new national security advisor for Joe Biden, has done a lot of work in the last 4 years since the defeat of Hillary Clinton, and how because he was a principal in her campaign, how do you connect the middle class and low-income people to a successful foreign policy? One of the issues you have to focus on is trade. And I'm just speaking personally here, it's just a private view. I do not expect the United States to be engaged in free trade agreements in 2021. You know, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement worked for us because labor standards were built in, environmental standards were built in, and the unions were brought into the process. You have a much more coherent, I think, as I understand Germany, you have a much more open system where unions have a voice. Our unions have been kept out. And I think we'll see that change in this administration. Second, we had a vigorous discussion of strategic autonomy, Jürgen. You mentioned it in our group. We debated back and forth whether we should include the words. We finally decided not to do that. I can only speak for myself. I think we should want Europe, and particularly Germany, as the strongest country, to be stronger and more self-reliant. I would even use the word more powerful. We welcome a more powerful Germany and a more powerful Europe and European Union. The problem with strategic autonomy, just I'll speak personally, is it implies to me an eventual separation, and we cannot be separated. If we are to do everything we have to do, Canada and the United States have to be tied to Europe, and that's through NATO. And that's through the strong partnership that we have with the EU. So I personally am not in support of strategic autonomy, but many other members of our group are. It was one of our more significant disagreements. And it was an interesting discussion, reflecting, I think, the official government discussion. Finally, someone asked in the chat, this is very ambitious. Maybe it's too ambitious. I agree with what Victoria Nuland said. We have to be ambitious. We have been, since the creation of NATO, we have been the strongest democratic voice and force, political force in the world. And we must become that again, because I'll tell you who has self-confidence these days. It's China, it's Russia, it's Viktor Orban, it's President Erdogan of Turkey. And we need to pull together and create a democratic part of the world that will stand up for our values. I will say this, Jürgen, and I know that you will appreciate this, given where you are, in which party you are. I think the strongest voice we have had internationally has been Angela Merkel in the last 4 to 5 years. I would say the last 4 to 6 to 7 years. I would include the Obama presidency in this. And many of us are deeply appreciative for what she has done for the West. We honored her at Harvard, where Catherine and I and Tori are working together. She spoke at our commencement a 1.5 years ago. She was a magnificent speaker, and she's deeply admired. I know maybe not every German agrees with this on this Zoom call, but I just wanted to say that because it gets to the final point, and that's on human rights and democracy. We have to have a louder voice. We say in the report, the United States has never condemned Russia for the attempted murder of Alexei Navalny. President Trump has been silent on the Uyghurs, silent on Hong Kong, silent on Belarus, and we need to be stronger. But we can't be stronger without you. And you, I think, can't be stronger without us. This gets back to being together. And so Daniela has heard me say this before. The last time Joe Biden was in Europe and in Germany, Deutschland, was February 2019 at the Munich Security Conference. And if you were there, he gave a compelling speech about, he said, there's another America beyond Trump's America. And that other America, which is the majority of the country, believes in NATO and believes in the European Union. And he said, we'll be back. And guess what? He'll be back on January 20th. I'm hopeful because of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Nick. We are glad that you're back. And I think after this evening conversation and after this year-long work on the report, we know that each side has to do lots of things to make this relationship as powerful as we want to have it. And tonight we were able to share some of the key ideas with you. And I want to thank you all for having stayed around so late and for engaging in many ways with us. I tried to read the chat while I was chairing this discussion, and there are many comments and questions, and I'm sorry if I couldn't pick up all of them tonight, but the conversation will continue. I think that's the good news. There's so much to do at DGAP, and I hope with HKS we will continue to exchange and work together. I hope that all members of the group will continue to engage on transatlantic relations. And I know that the 2 members of parliament who joined us for tonight's discussion definitely will. So we will continue the conversation. May I just highlight that we will be chairing Congressman Gregory Meeks next week. He's the chairman-elect of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and he will be in a conversation with Norbert Röttgen. Big thanks to my colleague Tyson Barker, who will be chairing that debate. He organized this, that we could host him at such an early date after the election, which is fantastic, I think, to continue this discussion. So thank you so much. Nick, everybody who was part of the group, I just want to say what a pleasure it was to work together and to produce this report. And we know many questions we haven't answered, but we'll continue working on them. And with that, I would like to thank you all for having been around tonight. Thanks.